fresh from a land that is far warmer than it is here. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Brother Mark Hixon. Thank you. Good morning, man.
Morning.
And aloha.
Aloha.
God, I haven't been this cold in years.
It's all right, no worries, mate. It's getting warmer.
Exactly. So who am I? I'm actually one of you. I lived in Corvallis for nearly 30 years and then was recently enticed to shift from Oregon State University to the University of Hawaii. And I see a lot of familiar faces, and it's great to be back. So thank you all so much. It's just an honor to be here. So what I want to do today is give you some background. For those of you who don't know me, I'll tell you just a little bit about who the hell I am. But my intention is to summarize the projections of climate disruption in the Pacific Northwest for you, based on the best available evidence that the scientific community has. And I want to start with this fabulous image from space of our land. And take into account that little thin line at the horizon, because it's very thin. I will show you that graphically later. But it's not a very big world, really, even though we're pretty tiny individually on it. So, who am I? I'm a marine biologist. And I got interested in this topic because I study the most fabulous ecosystems on this planet. Tropical coral reefs. This is the greatest concentration of species on the planet. Incredible services and products for humankind. But they're really the canary in the mine shaft of climate disruption. Very sensitive. The corals that make up the reefs, the trees of this undersea rainforest, actually have little single-celled plants that live in them. And that symbiosis is what allows the corals to grow in tropical waters. And they're always just a few degrees from this symbiosis breaking down. And so as the ocean is warmed, we're starting to see what's called coral bleaching, which is essentially those little cells get expelled from the coral. The coral turns white because the cells are what make the coral appear to be colored. And so we call that bleaching because the corals turn white, but it's really just that symbiosis breaking down. And if the water stays warm for too long, the corals die. And I'd followed the literature on climate change through my career, but it really struck home for me personally when my favorite coral reef that I'd studied for 10 years in the Bahamas died. Completely died. With no human beings nearby. This is a very isolated location where I was working. And the system went from one of abject beauty before my very eyes to this.
Oh, jeez. How long did it take to do that?
Well, the bleaching takes place overnight. But then when the corals die, they stand in place a while. Seaweeds start colonizing on them. Boring organisms get inside. Eventually, it's like a dead tree standing in a snag. Eventually collapses. And this is what you see is just a barren rubble pile with the seaweed growing on it. It was heartbreaking.
Can you tell us where this is, Mark?
Yeah, this is this particular shot is from Indonesia, I believe.
Mark, just a little louder, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my gumption back up here. Sorry.
Your grief is welcome.
It's kind of weird being a scuba diver and crying in your face mask and flooding yourself with tears. It was horrible. So that's one of the reasons I'm here. Is from that point onward, I shifted my career away from basic science and to trying to educate the public and try to effect some kind of change in the world. And what motivates me more than anything else are my kids. Thinking about what they're inheriting from us. And my daughter recently made me a grandpa, which makes it even more severe. So, so that's why I'm here, and that's who I am. So I'm going to focus today on the Pacific Northwest, our home. I'm not going to do too much in the way of global issues. And in 2010, I was fortunate to be one of the senior authors in a report that was mandated by the Oregon State Legislature, the Oregon Climate Assessment Report shown there on the left, leading the team that wrote the article on fish and wildlife. 70 authors were involved in this study. Someone asked about the IPCC, who funds them? Nobody funds them. Everybody just does the work because it's important to us as a group of scientists, social scientists and natural scientists. And the reason I want to point this report out is both this report and a slightly later report called Climate Change in the Northwest are online, readily available. And if there's one message I want you all to take home from my talk, it's get science from the scientists, please. There is so much misinformation floating around. Don't get it from blogs. Don't get it from TV and radio personalities. Please go to the scientists. The scientists are working on being better communicators. And these reports were actually written for legislators, so they're written in the best sort of English we could possibly do. So go to ocri.net, find the reports.
We'll have that link in the reference sheet I was talking about.
Great, great. OCRI is the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, which is based at Oregon State University. You want to know what's going on in the Pacific Northwest in detail, go there. I'm just going to give you an overview today. So, first I'm going to give you an outline of the talk, the good, the bad, and the ugly of climate disruption in the Northwest. There's actually some good. Invest in growing wines, and I'll show you why. We're going to do better. We're going to have much better wine growing up here, at least until things go totally to hell. Then there's a whole bunch of bad. Less snow, drier summers, including droughts. We already know these. With the less water running off, less salmon, more fires, more pests of various kinds, both at sea and on land. Greater coastal erosion as sea level rises, less shellfish from ocean acidification and other effects on sea life, including harmful algal blooms coastally, more invasive species, and more shifts in species ranges, both on land and in the sea.
But more people is more invasive species?
Yeah. Interestingly,
That too.
when we got all together, the Oregon Climate Assessment was all these different people who studied different aspects of the issue, and we all got together at the end and said, well, what's the worst thing here in Oregon? And we came to realize that Oregon's actually not going to do too badly, the Pacific Northwest, unless we cross the major tipping points, which I'll also talk about. But it's going to be sort of a refuge. So the projections right now is that the worst threat to Oregon is all these climate refugees are just going to be pouring in from the Southwest and elsewhere. And we're going to get inundated with people. I won't talk any more about that. That's a social science issue.
Mark, where did you
But
mean by
think
more ranges?
Hungarian border.
I'm sorry, I got two people talking at once. Go. You started.
More ranges in species? What is that?
Shifts in the geographic ranges of species. I'll give you the details. So
Okay.
this is just the outline right now. What was in the back?
I was just saying, think about what we're seeing in Hungary, between Hungary and Austria.
Yeah,
Syria,
exactly.
Syria.
Exactly. What about the ugly? The ugly are possible tipping points that were spoken about in Dean's film that I'll talk about as well. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what can I do? I have my own list, and of course, we'll be talking a lot about that over the course of the meeting. But first, how do humans cause climate change? A little basic science on what we are doing and the reality of it. All the stuff I'm giving you today, I'll tell you what is a projection or a guess versus what's a downright fact. And the climate change, what's causing it, is a downright fact. There's zero question in the scientific community, except for some scientists being paid off by the fossil fuel industry. So it all starts with the carbon cycle. And this is the most complicated thing I'll probably put on the screen today, but it's not that complicated. In the earth, carbon is the basis for life, and is brought into the biosphere by photosynthesis by plants. Plants take in carbon dioxide and create their biomass, and that biomass is passed up through the food web and stays in the food web. And eventually both the plants and the animals respire, we breathe, and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And when anything dies, it decomposes, and that decomposition goes back in. And that's a cycle that's been going on since life began on this planet. Now, climate change has taken place because we're suddenly releasing a bunch of fossil carbon dioxide. Over billions of years, a lot of plant material got buried due to various phases of the Earth's development. There was a bunch of marine single-celled plants that got buried at sea, and there was a bunch of plant material, big tree ferns and things that got buried on land. And when this stuff got buried, it didn't completely decompose. It only partially decomposed. So you have basically plant material that's now in a form of coal, which are these land plants that were buried long ago, and in a form of oil, which were these marine single-celled plants. And that's this old carbon, old photosynthesis that's just been stored away in the earth. Now, in a natural cycle, that stuff would gradually get back in when coal or oil got to the surface and decomposed fully and all that. But we found that this is a fabulous source of energy, and we've been powering our society on this stuff for the last 150, 200 years or so. And combusting or respiring that ancient photosynthesis very rapidly. So that's all that's happening. It's almost as if you can imagine the earth taking a big giant breath, holding it, and then suddenly letting it all out at once. And we're doing that by burning these fossil fuels. Now there are other natural sources of extra CO2 going into the atmosphere. One of these is volcanoes when they erupt. And so you often hear the pundits go, wow, one volcano does more than everything humans ever do. Well, that's nonsense. On average, the yearly CO2 emissions of volcanoes is less than 1/100th of the amount of this extra CO2 that humans are pouring into the atmosphere. So we are the dominant respirers, artificially and literally, on this planet.
Say, Mark,
Yeah.
could you go on a tangent briefly and explain the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide?
Sure, carbon dioxide is one carbon with two oxygens,
Sure.
and carbon monoxide is one carbon with one oxygen.
I got that.
Yeah.
Are both damaging and are both, I mean, what's their place in our environment?
Well, let's look. That's
If you're
perfect,
gonna cover
perfect
that, I'll-
timing, because
okay.
here are the gases that we are, acceleratingly expiring into the planet. So this is not the natural cycle. This is not, the biosphere without humans. These are human-caused carbon emissions. And what you'll see is over 3/4 of the emissions are carbon dioxide. That's why most of the concern is about carbon dioxide. Over half from burning fossil fuels. That's why the big focus has primarily been on burning fossil fuels. And then there's deforestation, which is the other major source of carbon dioxide, the clearing of the rainforest, things like that. All that carbon locked in those trees being burned and released into the atmosphere. And then methane, mostly from agricultural issues,
Cows.
both fertilizers and the cows. Nitrous oxide and FES is a fluorinated compounds like the CFCs that we finally have started to phase out because of the ozone hole. Yes?
Where does the carbon dioxide from concrete and cement fit on that?
It fits, that's a great question.
Mark,
The question is, where does CO2 from cement production,
Big,
which is
yeah.
a substantial source of CO2, where does it fit in? And I can't tell you explicitly. I know there's a lot of fossil fuel use involved, and it might be some of this other here as well. But yeah, that is a substantial amount. Was there another question?
Yeah, methane and permafrost melting.
What's that?
Melting of methane under the ocean in the permafrost.
I'll be talking about that explicitly when we get to the ugly.
All right.
So what are the activities of humans that produce these gases? You'll see it's actually a pretty even set of pie slices. Just from generating electricity is over a quarter. That's why conserving electricity is important. Transportation's 13%, agriculture's 14%, industry 19%, forestry 17%, and some other things as well. So everything we do, everything in our society generates extra
Mark,
carbon emissions.
I want to ask about the cowspiracy figures. Is it good to wait till the end, or while you're on this pie chart? Because that has agriculture 14%. Cowspiracy says it's bigger. So is it now, or you
Yeah,
want to talk
there's
about that later?
controversy about the figures being used
Yeah.
in that film, and
Methane is more effective, I think.
well, so methane is about 25 times as effective as a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. But the flip side of that is methane breaks down very rapidly, whereas carbon dioxide persists for hundreds of years. So okay, let's talk about methane now, and I'll get to it later. I've been pressing my colleagues who are experts in this about methane because there's so much talk about, the methane time bomb. The scientists call it the methane gun. I don't know why they call it the methane gun, but this is the idea that there's a huge amount of methane stored on land in permafrost, and it's just bacterial decay that's been sort of arrested, and methane molecules can be locked in ice, where it's called a clathrate or a hydrate. There's also a bunch of that in the deep sea, literally ice in the deep sea that has this methane trapped in it. And there's so much methane that if it was all released simultaneously for some reason, it'd be all over, basically. So scientists are not standing by and just ignoring this. They're studying the living hell out of it right now. And as far as I can tell, the consensus is that the probability of very rapid methane release is low. They're not as concerned about it right now as they are about carbon dioxide. But when we get to the ugly and we talk about these feedback loops, we'll see that there is a possibility of this type of very abrupt change taking place. But right now, scientific community consensus is that it's a fairly low probability. Okay? We'll get back to methane later, I promise.
Mark, I think in response to John's question, it's important before that chart goes away to put industry together with agriculture. Because there's nothing about, they're not concerned about ordinary eating of meat. It's the industrial production of meat that is killing the Gulf of Mexico, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my thought about that is that that chart there is that that's the way we're living in the late 20th and early 21st century. To provide all of the technology that we have. And that's an unspoken assumption, I think, that nobody really, 200 years ago, we were much less.
200 years ago is much different.
Yeah.
This is the present now for the world. This is all the nations of the world combined, the present assessment.
Can we let Mark run with his talk and then open discussion later on?
All right, so that's the type of gases that we're putting in, these greenhouse gases that warm the earth. how much are we actually putting in? Let's put that in perspective, because most people don't think about perspective. The view has always been that how can little humans possibly alter the biosphere? And it's not too hard to think when you just really think about, when you really look at how much air and water is on this planet. It's a very, very thin layer. If you took all the water on the earth and put it in a single drop, that's how big it would be.
Drinking
Took all
water,
the air in
fresh
the
water.
atmosphere.
fresh water,
Salt
salt water, and fresh
water,
water.
all water. Water on this planet. Salt water, fresh water, all of it. Right there.
Wow.
That's it. It's a very thin layer. Very thin layer. Yes, the earth is large, but the layer of water is very thin.
It's mostly water, the earth is mostly water, how do you get it?
Not volume.
This is the volume, this is all the water on the planet, period. Okay? That's it right here. It's a very thin layer. This is all the gases in the atmosphere.
Wow.
Also a fairly thin layer. So if you think about over 7 billion people and their activities, could they affect those 2 drops? Hell yes they can. Let's look at carbon emissions and put those in perspective. So there was a question about how much carbon do we put in the atmosphere every day. Well, you take 9 petagrams, which is a lot.
How many zeros?
And you divide that by 365, and that's the daily. So, how much carbon is 9 petagrams? Well, if you take solid carbon, okay, it'd be equivalent to over 26,000 Empire State Buildings every year. Atomized into carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and cast into the atmosphere. So how much is that on our globe? That would be a chain of Empire State Buildings reaching from Scandinavia to Cape Town, South Africa, or alternatively from here to Tokyo. Okay? That's a lot of carbon going into the atmosphere every single year. Yes, we can affect the climate, and we are. Now, a petagram is 1 billion metric tons. Okay? Now remember, a billion is 1,000 million. So that's a lot of carbon. So where's it go? 9 petagrams of carbon. Well, about a quarter to a third is directly absorbed by the oceans. It's just the surface of the oceans interfacing with the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide and other gases get dissolved in the ocean. Another quarter to a third, fortunately, are taken up by growing plants. As plants grow, that carbon dioxide stays in their tissues. Very important buffer for us, both of these. Thank goodness we have an ocean. Thank goodness we have plants growing on this planet.
Here's the, I'll ask later.
Okay. The rest goes into the atmosphere. And these are greenhouse gases, so what they do is when the sun's radiation comes down to the earth, it's reflected back as infrared radiation or heat. The carbon dioxide molecules and other molecules retain that heat and keep it from going back into space. It's just like a blanket, like a greenhouse. That's why they're called greenhouse gases.
So I do want to ask this now. Is the carbon dioxide interfacing with the ocean, is it neutralized kind of like it would be with plants?
I'm not sure what you mean by neutralized.
Of no harm and effect.
Very major harm. I'm going to get to that.
Can we hold our questions? Yeah. He's gonna explain these as he goes on.
Yeah, I don't mind the questions. I mean, discussion's fine with me, so don't be concerned about me being interrupted unless it bothers you.
It's bothering some of
Then
us.
speak your truth.
Is it bothering all of us?
Not the ones asking.
Yeah, we do have plenty of time for discussion. So the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are warming the atmosphere, and that warming atmosphere warms the oceans. The oceans are now warming, even at the deepest depths now of the abyss, we're starting to detect warming taking place. The ocean is also buffering not only taking in carbon dioxide, but also been taking in this extra heat. And then you ask about the CO2 that's absorbed by the oceans. Well, CO2 reacts with water and forms carbonic acid. Same acid as soda pop. And so the oceans are acidifying. And I'll get back to what's going to be going on there. So this is the reality of it. This is what's happening on our planet. So the result is that carbon dioxide is going up very rapidly. The up and down you see here are the samples from Mauna Loa on the big island of Hawaii. That up and down is beautiful. It's the earth breathing. The northern hemisphere, during the summer, the plants grow. Less CO2 is in the air. In the winter, they respire more, so more CO2 goes out. That's the planet breathing. But you can see this background trend of increasing CO2 through time. And if you've heard of 350.org, we passed 350 in 1990. That's why people talk about we need to go back to 1990. So we're up around 400 parts per million now. How unprecedented is that? We can go back in the record using ice cores and various other means. And this is what some people have been called the hockey stick model, for which Michael Mann was one of the professors in the film who was attacked by Congress for telling the truth. We can go further back now with ice cores in Antarctica. We can take the record back for the entire time humans have been on this planet, nearly 1 million years now. And what you see when you go further and further back is these oscillations in the amount of CO2 between the ice ages. Oops, I want to stop that one. These are all the people who did all this stuff. Look at all that work that goes into that stuff.
Wow, I was impressed by the touch screen.
Go back here. I'm going to run this one more time. Maybe get this to start. Anyway, the last clip you saw was the CO2 going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. During the low CO2 periods is where we go into the ice ages. The high CO2 periods is between the ice ages. And that change, that natural change, is caused by changes in the tilt of the Earth's axis, caused by the gravitational pull of the other planets. Okay? And that's the natural cycle, in ice ages, out ice ages, over the course of human evolution. What you hopefully saw at the very end was we're at one of those peaks now, natural peaks in CO2, but now by burning all the fossil fuels and doing all these other things, we've pushed CO2 up far greater than it's ever been as long as humans have been on this planet. And that's the great concern. So just let this run. I'll try to stop it this time. These are data compiled by NOAA, the federal government. I don't know if you can see that light blue curve in the back. It's not quite as visible, but stop now.
What does KY mean?
KY, 1,000 years. So this goes back, the ice cores go back 800,000 years now. So that's humanity. So we've lived on this planet through the ice ages, up and down. Now we're at one of these interglacial periods, and we're blasting the greenhouse gases way up. So another thing you'll hear the pundits say is, wow, the Earth has had periods of time when there's been a lot more CO2 on the planet. Hell yes there was, but there weren't humans on the planet back then. Okay, if you go way, 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 way back, hundreds of millions of years, there were times when there was way more CO2 on the planet. But it wasn't the Earth as we know it. It was not the Earth in which we evolved. This is our Earth. Associated with the up and down of the CO2 is temperature. You could almost put an identical plot on that. That's why we have such great concern now. So this is a temperature record since we had a global set of thermometers around the world for the 1880s. The blue means it's cooler than the long-term average. The warmer colors mean it's warmer than the long-term average. You can see the years ticking off, and you can start to see the accelerating warming that's been taking place in the last few decades. So where we are, we're on an exponential curve. So time on the x-axis, temperature on the y-axis, and a bunch of other bad stuff on the y-axis. An exponential curve starts out slowly and then rapidly accelerates. We're right here. We ain't seen nothing yet. And that's the concern we have for the future. So let's come to the Pacific Northwest now and get very specific. These are temperature readings in our region. These are all temperature stations, long-term monitoring stations from 1920 to 2000, looking at what temperature was like during that period compared to the long-term average. And you can see it's getting warm here. In fact, many places in the Pacific Northwest are getting warmer more rapidly than the Earth on average. That's because as you get to the higher latitudes, closer to the pole, it's warming more rapidly. So it's happening here, it's happening already. This is the past. You can't argue with these data. These data have already been gathered.
Are these stations just in Oregon?
No, these stations are in Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. That's a map, actually. So what about ocean acidification? I showed you the world warming. This is the availability of calcium carbonate. I'll explain that later. The years ticking off here, the darker colors mean there's not much calcium carbonate available for shellfish. The green areas mean things are okay. And watch again the rapid change that takes place as we go through this century. So what does that mean? That means that there's going to be less calcium carbonate available for shellfish and for the ear stones of fish. Calcium carbonate, limestone, clam shells, the hard parts of crabs. Lots and lots of things in the ocean have calcium carbonate skeletons. We have calcium phosphate skeletons, so we don't need to worry so much. Fish have calcium carbonate skeletons, but they have little bones in their ears called otoliths that are made out of calcium carbonate instead of calcium phosphate. So we're seeing developmental problems with fish and a lot of problems. I'll get back to this later. All right, now I want to go through the list. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The only good news I can find about climate change is it's a good time to invest in wineries in the Pacific Northwest. The map on the left is the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, showing presently the best wine growing areas. So Napa-Sonoma in the Bay Area, the Willamette Valley's doing well, Washington's doing okay. Look in the future. California loses its capacity to grow good wines. The Northwest gains its capacity to grow good wines. So I've given you some financial information on climate change that will help you, fund your
Assuming we have a planet to live in.
in preparing for the big changes forthcoming. And this is work by, wine growers. They're very interested in this, of course. And it's a good time to invest in wineries.
Mark, does that take into account the requirement of fertilizer?
This is just, the climate for growing wines. That's
Right.
all it is. So, yeah, there's a lot of other contingencies that could affect this.
Water.
Absolutely. Water. Yes.
Mark, I just want to point out another good that many people would espouse and would move to Oregon for is the years will on average be warmer, the summers will be warmer, and the summers will be drier, and less episodes of snow in the winter. Now, we can say that that's not good for the region or the average. Most people who live a comfortable life may like that on hearing that they would regard that as the good, and that's another thing that we're fighting.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that the Pacific Northwest is going to be a refuge for climate refugees. They're going to like that. They're going to come here. And that's, again, that was one of the conclusions of the Oregon Climate Assessment Report, is that perhaps the greatest threat to Oregon is just gonna be all the people moving here. Because it's not gonna be as bad here as it is gonna be elsewhere in the nation.
Well, when you say here, we're in southern Oregon, it looks to me like California is more like California.
Yeah.
Right.
Sucks for you guys.
Go north.
Come on up and pour it out. So let's look at what I consider the bad, and a lot of people consider to be the bad. Change in snowfall. Our precipitation is going to shift from snowfall to rain, pretty much. So these are projections for sort of business as usual projections and carbon emissions comparing 2031 to 2060 versus the last half of the last century. And what you can see is essentially, through most of the Cascades, about a 50 to 60% decline in snowfall projected by the climate models. These are projections based on the best available evidence. But otherwise, the Northwest is in a drying spell. Not as bad as California and Arizona, but still less snowfall. We're already seeing that in the loss of glaciers worldwide. There's a wonderful film out called Chasing Ice. And I think it's been on Netflix, but see that film. It's so well done. Time-lapse photography, watching the glaciers fade away. This is ancient ice from the last ice age. Glaciers are incredibly important as a source of meltwater during the summertime, and they're just disappearing. So this is one here in the Northwest on the Olympic Peninsula. In the Olympics, Glacier National Park will have no glaciers whatsoever within the next couple decades. So because of the less snowfall and the melting of glaciers, there's going to be reduced summer water, which is going to affect our fisheries and all aquatic life. This is a map and the projection for the 2040s done by the National Climate Assessment. In these brown areas, the dark brown areas you see are areas where there's going to be about a 50% reduction in water flow, which is clearly going to affect our already beleaguered salmon and other freshwater species, not to mention water available for agriculture and human use of various kinds.
And Mark, that decrease in water flow has, there's no measurement in there for temperature of the water, which is also...
The temperature will increase as well.
Certainly, and is that reflected in the...
Yeah. No, this is just the volume of water coming out, not the temperature of the water. But yeah, the projections are the waters are going to be getting warmer, we'll get shifts in species. The poor salmon, I mean, they got it from so many different directions. Not optimistic for them. So with drier summers, and we've already seen this is no news, we're seeing increased incidence of fires, and in the dryness, the forests are more susceptible to bark beetle and other insect pests.
Could you overview those 3 slides on the left of that big slide?
3 sides on the left?
Or the 3 pictures?
Yeah. So here we see, this is recent areas of fire in the red and insects and disease outbreaks in forests in the Northwest. These are now projected increases in the amount of burning. So through the Cascades, the projection is that there's going to be about a 4 to 5 time increase in the incidence of fires. And then this is a change in the probability of trees being able to survive mountain pine beetles infestations. And through the Cascades, for example, they're expecting about a 100% decline in the ability of trees to survive these outbreaks of beetles in these relatively dry conditions. So those are the projections, not good for our forests. Let's turn to the ocean. I'm going to show you real-time data comparing 1997, which at the time was the warmest year on record, to this year. You see the dates are the same. This is the Pacific Ocean. And what you'll start seeing is warm water along the equator, but look at the North Pacific. That red means warmer than usual temperatures, about 2 degrees centigrade, warmer than the long-term average. I call it the blob. And now we see this warming trend, call it El Nino. I gotta stop this before it runs out.
Just to say that a centigrade is like almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, like
Yes.
1.8, right? So
Yeah.
when people hear 1 degree, 2 degrees, doesn't sound like much, it's almost twice when you think
Yeah.
of Fahrenheit.
But that, those low numbers are so deceiving
Yeah.
because there's such major change that comes with them. Let me explain El Nino a little bit and then get back to the blob. So El Nino takes place so along the equator we have winds called the trade winds, and they tend to blow seawater toward the west, and you end up with, on the western side of the Pacific Ocean equatorially, you actually have higher sea level, and the water gets really warm there, and the trade winds just keep that going. That's normal condition. For reasons that are still not entirely certain, periodically, and this is projected to be worse with climate change, is a trade wind stop blowing. When the trade winds stop blowing, all that warm water literally sloshes back across the equator, hits the Americas, and flows north and south again, causing a condition called El Nino. El Nino, Spanish for the child, happens typically around Christmas time. Referring to the Christ. So the worst El Nino on record is 1997. That's the year my reef died. And it was the warmest year on record for many years. And then we went into a brief cooling period because of solar activity, the sunspot cycle. And now everything's back and going. But compare these 2 years. This is the same date. We've got a strong El Nino forming, not quite as strong as 97, but already the North Pacific is way warmer than usual. And I mean, things are crazy in Hawaii right now. In Hawaii this summer, the trade wind stopped and it got hot. Hawaii has this fabulous climate where the trade winds keep things nice and cool and everything's nice. No trade winds for 2 months. It got really oppressively hot. That warm water spawns hurricanes, and that's one of the issues going on in the tropics. And there was a period of time this summer where here's Hawaii, and there was a Category 4 hurricane here, a Category 4 hurricane here, and a Category 4 hurricane here. Unprecedented. 4 major hurricanes bowling for islands. Fortunately, we didn't get hit. In any case, this warm water is affecting our climate here and exacerbating this drought that we've been having. It's deflecting rain patterns away from the coast. How long will this go? I don't know.
But the El Ninos should bring torrential rains to California.
Good.
Correct?
A typical strong El Nino will bring lots of rain to California and relative drought to the northwest. So we can expect a mild winter here. California will get rain, but they're projecting that it won't be nearly enough to break a 5-year drought. Actually, there's just a report that came out last week that went back in the tree ring records and saw that this is the worst drought in California in 500 years. Since Europeans have been in the Americas.
Mark, are you going to talk about the blob and how it's affecting the Pacific?
I just did a little bit.
I'm talking about the
Yeah, it's sea surface. I can't give you an exact depth of it, but the thing is, it's a persistent feature. So the main effect it has on us is rainfall. Here. But I'm going to get into the ocean now. Okay. So starting at the coast, sea level is rising around the world. The projections have been very conservative about sea level rise because somebody asked about, why is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so conservative? It's because they're under intense scrutiny. So they're doing their very best, this volunteer group of over 1,000 climate scientists, to provide accurate information, but they're very afraid to sound alarmist because they're already disregarded. They don't want to be completely disregarded. So on the sides, scientists are publishing papers that show, you know, the reality of what's going on. And the reality is that climate change is where IPCC is the farthest off of all its projections. The current projection is about a 1 meter sea level rise by the end of this century, which will completely remove some Pacific islands, inundate Bangladesh, and cause a lot of problems in South Florida and elsewhere on the east coast of the U.S., but, you know, it's just 1 meter.
3 feet.
The actual projections are going to be several meters at least, and all bets are off with sea level rise right now because we're losing ice so rapidly from Greenland, those glaciers, and the West Antarctic ice shelf. And one thing to keep in mind, when ice is in the ocean floating and it melts, it doesn't do anything to sea level rise. The only thing that raises sea level is ice that's on land that then melts and flows into the ocean. But until recently, most of the sea level rise, about half of it, has actually just been from thermal expansion of water. As water gets warmer, it expands. So the USGS has been studying sea level rise and trying to look at sort of erosional rates along the coast, and there's no way to see this. These maps are so poorly done, these little tiny blobs of water, blobs of color. But this is the percentage of how badly coastal erosion is going to be on the west coast of the U.S. And you can see about half of the west coast is going to have high or very high erosional levels depending upon where you are. So here's a little more economic information. If you own a beautiful beach house in southern Oregon, you're relatively safe. If you have one in northern Oregon, you should sell it as soon as you can. So this is a map of the Oregon coast turned on its side. Okay, so this is Astoria up here. Here's Gold Beach down here, and then we go into California, Crescent City. Okay, you oriented now? Okay, these dots represent tide stations where they're looking at long-term changes in sea level. And you'll notice it kind of dips down here and goes up here in the south part of the state. Florence is sort of the demarcation line. We live in a geologically very active area, a subduction zone, and it turns out that at least for current levels of sea level rise, that the coast is uplifting in South Oregon faster than sea level is rising. So it's a good place to have your beach house. Enjoy it while you can. The same is not true once you get north of Florence. Okay, sea level is steadily rising there, and that's why we see things like Nescoin Beach being inundated by storms in the wintertime. So there's a little more economic advice. The problem is that sea level is going to rise much more rapidly and continue to rise much more rapidly, and all this is going to go away. Okay, the level of rise is going to finally exceed the rate of geologic uplift that's taking place. So enjoy your beach house for a while in the southern Oregon coast. Also happening in the ocean, we talk about pest outbreaks of insects and forests on land. In the ocean we have pests that are called harmful algal blooms. These are single-celled species that secrete toxins and get concentrated up the food web, essentially, making shellfish toxic for humans. So this shows data from NOAA showing pre-1972 outbreaks. PSP is paralytic shellfish poisoning. So you occasionally hear about, don't eat clams and mussels on the Oregon coast right now. That's when there's outbreaks of these blooms because they get concentrated by these filter feeders. At present, we're already having far more outbreaks of a huge variety of harmful algal blooms because the ocean's getting warmer. It's very clearly related to how warm sea temperatures are and associated changes in nutrients that take place by human activities. So the big two along our coast are, again, this paralytic shellfish poisoning, but also amnesiac shellfish poisoning. These are neurotoxins that get concentrated in seafood. If you ingest them, you have severe neurological problems. That sucks. And then the shift in species distribution. So this is happening on land as well as in the sea. So what we're essentially seeing worldwide, globally, is species are shifting their distributions. those that can, toward the poles. So as it gets too warm in the tropics, they move into temperate areas. As it gets too warm in temperate areas, they move toward the poles. The species that are losing are the ones that live on mountaintops and the ones that live at the poles. So the polar bear, for example, no place for polar bears to go. Species that are endemic and found nowhere else at the top of Cascade Mountains, they have no place to go. When that ice goes away, they'll be lost. The same is taking place in the oceans. And some of these shifts are kind of cool and some of these really suck. So, for example, we're starting to see in late summer mahi-mahi or dorado being caught off the Oregon coast where the water gets really warm. During a strong El Nino, you'll see coral reef fishes, their little larvae, coming up the coast, and then winter comes and they'll croak because it gets too cold. But along with these, relatively cool fish coming in to eat, you get things like Humboldt squid, which have been moving into our coast. These things are nasty. They're about the size of a human being. You never want to get in the water with one because they will attack you. They're voracious predators. And there's evidence on the other side of the equator, down along the coast of Chile, that they're decimating fisheries. They're actually eating the fish that we would eat otherwise. So what's happening is the world's species are being scrambled by shifts in the climate. And we don't know who the winners are going to be, who the losers are going to be. People are doing studies now to try to figure that out. But it's a whole new world that we're facing. And finally, ocean acidification. What happens when all that CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, which saves us from extra warming, is that it reacts with seawater and forms carbonic acid. And carbonic acid then locks up with carbonate ions and prevents animals and plants in the ocean from growing their skeletons, essentially. And the effects are insidious and out of sight, out of mind, but very, very real. So this is the shell, little snail shell of a little tiny planktonic animal called a pteropod. Nobody even knows what a pteropod is. The pteropod shells cannot live in acidic oceans. Their shells dissolve. Why would we care about pteropods? Well, pteropods feed salmon smolts at sea. So we're losing the forage base for our salmon. More tangibly, the oyster industry in Oregon and Washington has been suffering terrible hits because the water is too acidic for them to grow the new spawn, the new spat of baby oysters. They're now growing them out in Hawaii, which is a long story, and then shipping them back when they get a little older and are relatively impermeable to the acidification. But this is real and happening. In the geological past, there's been periods of acidifications that were so intense that they accounted for many of the great extinctions that took place. This is very simple chemistry. The scientists who studied this say the projections are far more accurate and have much less uncertainty than the climate projections, because this is just happening and it's going to continue to happen. Yeah.
Would you recommend, Mark, to stop eating any kind of marine life, that we've come to the point where it's not safe to eat shrimp or calamari or anything that you can think of?
We need seafood. Seafood is a major source of protein for humans. It's about a quarter of the protein. And of course the rest is cows, which is a So what we really need to do is become more vegetarian. There's no question. We need to feed lower on the food web.
We're okay with the fish as it is now?
There's fish that's safe to eat now, and there are sustainable fisheries now, and there are people whose lives depend on those fisheries. So I love seafood, and I eat sustainable seafood. If you want a guide on that, go online to Seafood Watch. It's a Seafood Watch, W-A-T-C-H. It's a program by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and they issue regional seafood purchasing guides. And they say,
Fits in your wallet.
go ahead and eat this, don't eat that, and be careful of that. Oh, and by the way, this has a lot of mercury in it, and all these other things. So there are sustainable seafoods to eat, but ultimately we need to become vegetarians. Is the bottom line. Thanks, Grant.
Mark, at this point, could you talk about solubility of CO2 and water temperature? As the temperature increases, what happens to the solubility of CO2?
It declines. I'm going to be getting to that soon. Thank you. Other questions? So this brings us to the ugly. And this is where all we have are projections. We have some data from past events. Again, my colleagues are mostly saying these things are possible, but with low probability, as far as they can tell. So this little cartoon sort of tells a story. Business as usual is we're pushing the ball to the edge of the cliff. If we can reduce carbon emissions sufficiently, we might push the ball back. But if we go over the edge, we're going to have very, very rapid change. This is the abrupt climate change that Dean was talking about. And these tipping points are based on what are called positive feedback loops, which seems like a misnomer because it seems like a very negative thing. But a positive feedback loop is simply a reinforcing loop, where once the loop gets started, it can just spin out of control. And the scariest one of these is this one, that as the temperatures rise and we get permafrost thawing, but there's even more methane in the deep sea hydrates, that there'll be extra carbon dioxide and methane released in the atmosphere, which will cause even more rapid warming and more release, and it just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning out of control. There are about a half dozen or so of these that are possible, some of which have occurred in the past, but in the distant past when the Earth was much different. And these are they. I don't want to go through each one individually, but let me go through them because some are very real and happening right now, very important, and some are relatively conjectural. The worst one going on right now, very clearly, is the melting of Arctic and polar ice in general. Ice is highly reflective, so when sunlight hits ice, that sunlight bounces right back into space. So ice actually keeps itself cool. But as the world warms, and sea ice melts, it exposes water that very much absorbs that heat. So as the temperature rises, you get less ice, and with less ice, you get less reflectivity, or albedo as scientists call it, and therefore it gets warmer, and that's a vicious cycle. We're losing the North Polar ice cap. It's going to be gone within a couple decades. And huge changes in the Arctic going on right now, major, major changes. Now that thawing can also be taking place on land with the melting of the permafrost, which is a layer of frost underneath the soil, and partially digested plant material in there is loaded with, or partially decomposed is loaded with methane. Also, wetland peats and bogs have the same thing. And the deep sea methane hydrates, these ice crystals in the deep sea that are locked in with methane. All these have the same feedback loop. If it gets warm enough and these melt, then you're going to get this sudden burst of these very severe gases taking place. Being very closely studied by the scientific community.
The permafrost, Mark, is it mostly in the northern latitudes?
Yeah, primarily, because when you get to the, if you look down on the North Pole, you have much more land in the Arctic than if you look up at Antarctica, which is surrounded by ocean. So that most of the tundra is in the northern hemisphere. So the question was just raised about what's called clogging the ocean sink, and that is as the seawater temperature rises, it has less capacity to absorb CO2, which is bad from the standpoint of warming, but good from the standpoint of acidification. So God knows what's going to happen with us. And then you have feedback loops that happen with rainforests, including our own forests. Forests in general, dense, thick forests, tend to produce their own sort of local atmosphere with rainfall cycles and what have you. When we clear that, the drying is exacerbated, and so things get warmer and drier more rapidly. So we've got all these positive feedback loops out there that are possible, some of which are very much happening, some of which are relatively conjecture at this point. So I want to finish with my own list of, what can I do? I absolutely believe in the power of one. You saw the quote by Margaret Mead, maybe, if you saw the little slide clips that were going on. Never doubt that a small group of concerned, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And that's true. So what can we do? We can educate ourselves and others. You guys are doing that. Thank you so much for listening. Is Michael Fortune here?
Sure.
Keep your hand up, Michael. Michael is one of the people who is educating us on climate change science. And he has an online forum called Climate Science Forum. Talk to this man. He's living in Portland?
Portland.
In Portland now. For a while he worked with OCRI, the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, and he's all about bringing the science to the people. And so we have a man here in our own community who's doing that. So I recommend the Climate Change Forum. If you just Google that name, it'll pop up. 2 other places to stay on top of climate science, the latest climate science, and not get bullshit, okay? To get good, hardcore, peer-reviewed, well-vetted science are 2 other web pages. One's called Skeptical Science. It's run by John Cook, who was running the interview in Dean's talk. He's down in Australia. And the other is Climate Central, based here in the United States. The subtitle of Climate Central is Climate Science from Climate Scientists.
Concept.
So Mark, on education, there was another book or movie you mentioned with a one-word title earlier today, and I lost what that was. Water? Ocean?
Chasing Ice was the one I mentioned. Chasing Ice, great film. Shows time lapses of glaciers going away. Okay, we can all reduce our fossil fuel use. Remember, everything we do uses fossil fuels. You buy bottled water, what is heavier than water? Almost nothing is heavier than water. We're burning fossil fuels to transport water around the world.
And the plastic is
all made out of fossil fuels. Anyway, everything we do can reduce fossil fuel use. There's many guides on how to do that. We can do the other thing, which is bring carbon dioxide out, as well as put out less, and that is grow trees and native plants. I say native plants because native vegetation, better than exotic vegetation usually, is better at sequestering and holding that carbon dioxide in its root systems and it's elsewhere. So grow plants, man. Plant a tree for the future. Divest from fossil fuels. This is a movement that started in university campuses and is starting to catch hold with investment firms and corporations. The Rockefellers have divested, amazingly.
Yeah.
We got a group of us helped get University of Hawaii to divest recently. The universities in Oregon have not divested yet. And the simple thing is that you can divest, that is, get rid of fossil fuel investments in your portfolio and not affect your income at all. So it's like, why not do it? This is what finally ended apartheid in South Africa with divestment. Support organizations that are on the front lines fighting these, like 350.org, Bill McKibben's group, and others. Vote for the climate. There is a choice. I usually see it as the lesser of 2 evils, but there is a choice. Think about the climate as, a top issue on your agenda. We must foster hope and action. Our worst enemy, I believe, is despair. Despair leads to denial and inaction. We'll finish up with a couple of books I recommend. And then finally, we have to adapt. These changes are coming. If we stop all carbon emissions right now, most of what I've said is still going to take place. Yeah. But it will be much less if we reduce our carbon emissions. It'll buy us time. So we're going to have to adapt. And I've given you a few ways to do that. So just last slide is a couple books that have helped me. because I can't tell you, every single freaking day online, I get a new publication by well-respected scientists that is bad news. Every day, every day, every day. It's so easy to get depressed. And I fight depression over this issue. But I cannot be depressed over this issue. I don't have time to be depressed. So we have to foster hope and action. So Jane Goodall's book touched me as a fellow scientist who studied chimpanzees. She's very eloquent about change can occur, how kids are starting to see the differences and other things. And then Paul Loeb, who's an activist in Seattle, wrote a couple books, Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Cynical Time. There's another book called The Impossible Will Take a Little While, which is a series of, the second book is just an edited volume with a bunch of short stories by real people like us who thought they made no difference in the world, and it turns out they did make a major difference in the world. And that's what it boils down to.
The impossible will take a little while.
The Impossible Will Take a Little While. That's Paul's other book. So I recommend those books. I'm happy to answer any questions I can. Thank you very much.
So now we have about 10 minutes set aside for Q&A. So if you have concise questions, this would be a good time for it.
Just going to ask about methane gas. Does that not biodegrade into water vapor or carbon dioxide?
Right. That's why methane is a good bad gas. It's a bad gas because while it exists, it's much more effective, about 20 times as effective per molecule as carbon dioxide in warming the planet, but it breaks down rapidly. So that's the
carbon dioxide, which is a...
Carbon dioxide persists.
Yeah.
So the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere is going to be there for hundreds of years. Yeah. The methane will not. So the reason the scientists aren't quite as concerned about methane yet is even though there are emissions, they're breaking down.
Right.
It's not growing at a rapid rate.
Right.
But if there was suddenly a super warming and all that methane was released at once, then we'd be in deep shit. But right now, that breakdown is helping us.
The primary emissions from vehicles is CO2.
It's carbon dioxide.
Compared to what we already have.
Did you say Seafood Watch?
Seafood Watch is the seafood group.
Question?
Mark, is this presentation available in its own?
Yeah, what I could do is I'll make a PDF of it because it's way too big to put online. But I'll make a PDF of it and give it to Dean to put on the webpage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, also what we could do is we could make a file, something they could view on YouTube if you're willing, and I'd post it on my channel if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Great.
That'd be fun.
Mark? So, the Amazon rainforest is a big source of our oxygen, yes?
Any growing forest is.
Okay, but there's another source of oxygen, right? A plankton that's
Plankton is
broken
the
down
force
by
of the
viruses, and then it's like a war going on. But there's a huge amount of oxygen that comes from that. So what is acidification and warming doing to those guys?
Good question. So about half the oxygen, free oxygen that we breathe and need on this planet is produced on land, and about half is produced in the oceans. On land, it's any kind of growing plants. Plants, while they're growing, are pulling carbon dioxide out and having a net increase in oxygen. In the ocean, it's much more rapid turnover because most plants in the ocean are single-celled. And the question was, will ocean acidification affect those? And there's one group that will be affected because there's actually some single-celled plants that have calcium carbonate skeletons. And they're called coccolithophores. And coccolithophores become the forage base for things that end up feeding our fisheries ultimately. So there's a big loss. Overall, the projections for phytoplankton productivity go all over the map because it's so dynamic. Phytoplankton have very short generation times, like all single-celled organisms, so they may be able to adapt very rapidly to the changes that are taking place, unlike slow-growing, long-lived species. Great question.
Two things. A book by James Lovelock, the eminent scientist, called A Rough Ride to the Future, is actually a very positive outlook for the planet. He developed the Gaia principle.
Yeah, the Gaia hypothesis.
And that's excellent. The other thing is, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like progressives and scientists tend to not have a strong voice that calls bullshit on these commentators and non-scientists and scientists that are putting out untruth. And are you seeing a significant, loud voice that will call bullshit on that and tell the facts?
Thank you, that's a great question. I highly recommend a book, and there's actually a documentary out now called Merchants of Doubt. Merchants of Doubt exposes the scientists who have been bought by industry. And it's amazing. There are guys on the National Academy of Sciences, even some Nobel laureates, who were paid by the tobacco company to say that tobacco smoke doesn't cause cancer. And the same guys are being paid by the oil companies to say global warming's not taking place. The same guys! It's unbelievable. Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes is a great one. And the answer is, yes, scientists are slowly starting to step up. The problem is that historically scientists tend to be nerdy guys who are not comfortable around people, especially speaking to groups, and they don't have the skills. And for the long time there was this called the wall of science. Scientists were to be doing their jobs, handing the data to society and shutting up. But that's not going to save the world, there's no question about it. So a bunch of us are starting to get rowdy.
There's one more recommendation would be Jeff Masters started Weather Underground, based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and San Francisco. Mainly focused on weather, but he blogs. So if you're looking for something ongoing rather than a book is great, but you may be seeking something more ongoing like a blog or a commentary. Jeff Masters has frequently comments and blogs on these issues.
What I want is somebody like Joe Biden, who's big and loud, who will say often, bullshit. That's just not true. Here's the truth.
Well, Al Gore was such a person, and you've seen what happened.
He was
to him.
too polite. We need somebody who will kick some ass, in my opinion.
Oh.
Donald Trump.
How about Reverend Michael Dowd, D-O-W-D, have you ever heard of him?
Not offhand. Well, remind me.
He's very, very upfront and vocal. I came across him on Buddha at the gas pump. It's a ongoing. He interviews people, and this guy is on fire.
I love that name, Buddha at the gas pump.
Well, that's a man that does a lot of interviews. It's usually about spiritual stuff, but he also has scientists and educated people on. But this guy was just flipping him over, man. He's merging the religious take and science and marrying the two and showing how we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to write a book about that kind of stuff right now.
Well, when he said somebody will tell the truth, he's in your face.
That sounds good.
So,
Thank you.
He might, I don't know, that's why I wanted to mention, if you knew about him, if he's one of the good guys.
I haven't been, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
What effect, if any, does climate change have on earthquakes?
None of which I'm aware of. But there may be.
There was something that I saw somewhere where I don't know if it's true or not, where they put something in the atmosphere and it gets rid of CO2, like gas, or they send a plane and people can shoot out this gas that help.
Weather modification.
No, we're talking, well, it's in a broad category called geoengineering.
Yeah.
That is, can the scientists come up with some great scheme to save us? And almost all the geoengineering schemes scare the living crap out of me. Because they're things like, let's cover the stratosphere in sulfates. Like every time there's a major volcanic eruption, you get sulfate spewed into the stratosphere, and it cools off for a while. Okay, but they're talking about let's do it with planes and cover it all. But we may create our own tipping points. I don't know about that one particular.
Maybe that was it.
Yeah, I don't know about that one. But another one is let's fertilize the oceans so that the plant productivity goes way up, and therefore more CO2 gets pulled into the ocean.
Oh, yeah.
Or let's take the CO2 and pump it into the deep sea. Well, if you like the oceans, those are both really bad things.
Has there been any effect of fresh water coming from like Greenland and ice melting on the Gulf Stream? Doesn't the salt water like pull like Gulf Stream from the bottom up to
yeah, it actually, yeah, that's a great point. So the idea is if Greenland melts, how will that affect ocean circulation in the North Atlantic, and how will that affect things? It actually happened at the end of the last ice age. There was a huge lake where basically Hudson Bay is now. And an ice dam broke loose, and the North Atlantic got flooded with fresh water, and it basically diverted and shut down the Gulf Stream, and Europe went into a mini ice age. It was starting to warm, and suddenly got really cold for X thousands of years or whatever. There's concern that if Greenland melts very rapidly, and it's certainly accelerating, that you could have a similar effect now. That is, ironically, as the Earth warms, you can have little mini ice ages regionally caused by diversions of ocean currents, because the northern and the polar latitudes get their heat from the sun, not so much directly, but by ocean currents and atmospheric circulation, moving the heat from equatorial areas toward the poles.
We got a couple more minutes.
Okay, Neil.
I'm curious, within the, you've made this move from pure science to science and trying to make change in the world. And what I've seen is, especially in America, we don't, when I say we, America, seems to not really want to listen to the political body so much as the entertainment industry. Movie stars, music stars, people will listen to them all day, right? And it seems, is there a move within the science and scientific body to say, well, if we're not going to get what we want over here within politics, maybe we could do that within the entertainment industry to try and help spread a message.
Yeah, it's happening. One example is there's a, I don't know the name of it really, but there's a program at USC, which is famous for its film thing, where a very successful, Marty Kaplan, a very successful TV producer from Hollywood is running this. And what he's doing is bringing in writers for TV shows, sitcoms and all these other stupid things that are on TV, and he's influencing the writers to just put in little messages about climate change and other environmental issues in the standard bullshit. So it's like, you're going to have a show about, Mary's hair turned purple or something, and it's like, wow, it's a hot day today. Yeah, well, it's that climate change. The world's getting warmer. Yeah, I know about that. So anyway, my hair turned purple. But anyway, it's just like, so it gets people sort of subliminally going, oh yeah, climate change, yeah, I knew that was real all along.
Well, in reality, that's what they're doing with advertising, right? You put Coca-Cola.
That's what advertising does.
Right? So if you can embed Coca-Cola in a TV program, why can't you embed science?
That's what the attempt is right now. So there are people, there's good minds working on this.
This is a big question for me that, I might want to throw out to all of us. I am a scientist, and I was turned off by the entertainment culture decades ago. And I'm quite disconnected with TV, movies, and popular entertainment. My housemate Liam is very well connected and sees the world and communicates with the world and learns from the world very differently than I do. And I have the same concern as you and the same want that the entertainment or the popular media, tell what's happening, tell what's real. But how? How do we do that? I don't really know.
I'll put a plug in for DirecTV compared to Comcast. DirecTV airs at their base package, the lowest package, Democracy Now! And Lake TV, which is worldwide information, every day, 24 hours a day.
So go with DirecTV.
Comcast doesn't offer it, period.
So go for DirecTV.
Yeah.
There's one big change.
But you have to you have to want it. And my point is like, there's a lot of our society that doesn't want that. They want to be entertained and they'll listen to.
So you can slide it in the entertainment, maybe. That way. You had your hand on.
Naomi Klein has written a book called This Changes Everything. And one of the assertions is that there are no non-radical solutions to climate change now that we've dithered so long. Would you agree with that?
We're getting very close. I mean, we've been doing nothing for so long. Every year that passes, it's going to be that much harder to bring things under control. So, yeah, we need a revolution. We do. We need a revolution at all levels. It doesn't have to be a violent revolution, but we definitely need a revolution. We need a revolution of world views.
Consciousness.
And a revolution in the heart.
Yes.
Projects out. No question.
Last question.
What about enlightened self-interest? The guys who have the power and the money and they're making short-term money, yes, and they have a lot of, they're happy right now, do they get it? Or can they get it? That they're gonna die too. And so are all their children, all their grandchildren, they're gonna be gone.
I don't know. All I know is I'm usually able to get the greatest traction with people who have children.
Right.
Yeah. People who don't have children are relatively difficult to get traction with.
Right.
And I'm reminded of a wonderful TV spot that was put out the Environmental Defense Fund, or maybe it was Natural Resources Defense Council, I don't remember, but it showed a guy, a man, like one of us, standing on a railroad track with a train coming in the distance. And he said, the worst aspects of climate change are going to take place in about 30 years. I don't have to worry about anything. And so he steps off the track, and casually behind him is a little girl with a train just about to hit her.
Oh.
Thank you again.
Thank you.